Nobody in the Windermere family talked about the agreement out loud. Not at the dinner table, not on the porch at dusk, when the sky turned the color of old copper and the cattle settled into silence. It was simply understood, the way certain things in ranch families always were, that Byron would honor it, because his father had given his word, and a Windermere word was the only currency that never lost its value out here. Byron had not argued. That was the part that bothered him most when he lay awake at night listening to the wind drag itself across the high grass. He had not argued, not fought it, not even asked the question that sat heaviest in his chest. He had simply nodded at his father's bedside, watching the old man's eyes search his face for resistance and find none, and that had been enough. The agreement stood. What he knew about Iola Surrency could fit inside a single breath. She was the youngest daughter of a rancher 2 counties west, a man his father had once called the most quietly powerful person he had ever shaken hands with. Beyond that, Byron knew almost nothing. No one had offered a description. No one had volunteered her age, her temperament, her history. The only thing his father's old foreman, a leathered man named Cord, had said when Byron pressed him was this: "She's not what anyone expects." Then Cord had walked away and never elaborated. Byron had chosen to interpret that as gently as possible. He told himself it meant she was quiet, perhaps bookish, perhaps a little severe in the way some women raised on isolated ranches could be, practical to a fault, uninterested in softness. But he had built a version of her in his mind the way a man builds a fence, not because he wanted to, but because the open space made him uneasy. He was not proud of the picture he had drawn, but he had drawn it anyway. The morning of the wedding arrived the way most difficult mornings do, without drama, without warning. Just a pale gray light pushing through the bunkhouse window, and a rooster somewhere making its indifferent announcement to the world. Byron dressed slowly. His good shirt had been pressed and left folded on the chair by the door. His boots had been polished by someone who had done it quietly and without being asked. Small kindnesses had a way of feeling like pressure when a man was already carrying enough. He rode out alone. And the ranch hands had offered to accompany him, and he had declined with a short shake of his head that nobody questioned. The trail west took him through a corridor of old mesquite and across 2 dry creek beds before the land opened up into the wide, grass-pale expanse that belonged to the Surrency family. He had never been on this land before. It was larger than he expected. The fences were older but well kept, the kind of place that did not need to announce itself. A small church sat at the edge of the property, white-painted wood, modest steeple, the kind of building that looked like it had been placed there by someone who understood that faith in remote country needed a permanent address. A handful of wagons were already gathered outside. Byron counted them without meaning to, which meant there were people inside who would watch whatever happened next. He had not thought about the watching. He sat on his horse for a moment longer than necessary. Inside, the church smelled of pine resin and candle wax, and something faintly floral that he could not name. The pews held perhaps 30 people, ranch hands, neighboring families, a few older women in dark dresses, who studied him with the particular attention of people who have already formed their opinions. A minister stood at the front, patient and unhurried, the way men of his profession learned to be. Byron took his place. The doors at the back of the church remained closed. A minute passed, then another. He kept his eyes forward. He was aware of people watching the side of his face, and he gave them nothing to read. This was a skill the Windermere men had always possessed, the ability to stand still inside a moment that was moving around them. Then someone in the back pew shifted. A child whispered something. One of the older women pressed her handkerchief to her mouth in a gesture that was not quite grief and not quite surprise, but something that lived between the two. Byron heard the doors open behind him. He heard the soft, measured sound of footsteps moving up the aisle, unhurried, deliberate, carrying no apology for the silence they arrived in. He did not turn around immediately. He waited, the way his father had always told him to wait. Let the moment come to you, son. Chasing it only makes you look desperate. And then she was beside him. He turned. The veil was ivory, fine as morning mist, and it obscured everything and nothing all at once. But he could see the shape of her, tall, composed, shoulders carrying a stillness that did not come from shyness. She was looking straight ahead at the minister. Not at Byron. Not at the room. Just forward, as though she had already decided that whatever was about to happen, she would meet it standing upright. The minister began to speak. Byron heard perhaps one word in 5. Because he was trying to understand what he was seeing through that veil, trying to reconcile the woman standing beside him with the plain, unremarkable figure he had constructed in his mind over the past 3 months. The two images would not sit together. They refused to overlap. He told himself it was the light, the candles, the way fabric and shadow could deceive a man. And he told himself that, right up until the moment the minister nodded gently and said the words that meant it was time. Iola reached up with both hands, slowly, without hesitation, and lifted the veil. Byron Windermere, a man who had broken horses, buried his father, and never once been described as a man who lost his composure, stood in that small white church in the middle of nowhere and forgot, completely, what he had been about to say. The woman beside him was not what he expected. She was not what anyone in that room expected, judging by the silence that fell so completely that the candle flames seemed to pause with it. But what stunned Byron was not simply what he saw. It was the expression in her eyes when she looked at him for the first time. Calm, direct, and carrying something underneath that he could not name. Something that looked almost like a question she had been waiting a long time to ask. And then, very quietly, before the minister could continue, he did something no one in that church anticipated. She looked away. The reception was held on the open land behind the church, long tables set under a stretch of canvas rigged between 4 tall posts, food laid out by women who had clearly been cooking since before dawn. It should have felt celebratory. It looked the part. But there was something underneath the surface of it, a current that Byron could feel without being able to name, the way you sense a change in weather before the sky gives any indication. People were watching Iola, not rudely, not openly, but in the way that people watch someone they recognize without being certain from where, a sideways attention, and a second glance held a beat too long. Byron noticed it because he was watching her too, though he was working considerably harder to make it appear that he wasn't. She moved through the gathering with a quietness that was not timidity. She spoke when spoken to. She smiled, not the wide, performed smile of someone eager to be liked, but something smaller and more deliberate, offered selectively, and therefore meaning more when it came. She accepted a plate of food from one of the older ranch women and said something that made the woman laugh unexpectedly, then cover her mouth like she hadn't meant to. Byron stood near the far end of the table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and tried to understand what was happening inside his own chest. He had married her. That was the plain fact of it. The words had been said. Well, the minister had closed his book. The small congregation had exhaled in a collective release that Byron now understood had been held for a reason. Whatever Iola Surrency, Iola Windermere now, carried with her into that church. People had been waiting to see how it would land. He still didn't know what it was. Cord appeared beside him with the particular silence of a man who had spent decades moving around livestock and had applied the same skill to human gatherings. "You all right?" Cord asked. "Fine," Byron said. Cord looked at him the way old men look at young ones when they've just said something technically accurate and entirely unconvincing. He didn't push it. He stood there a moment, watching the gathering, then said, "Her father was Edmund Surrency." Byron turned his head slightly. "Was?" Cord repeated, at confirming what the word implied. "Passed 14 months ago. Left everything to her. Every acre, every head of cattle, every account at every bank from here to the territorial capital." He paused to let that settle. "She's been running it alone since. Didn't tell anyone outside the county. Didn't ask for help. Just ran it." Byron looked across the gathering to where Iola stood, now listening patiently to an elderly man who appeared to be telling a very long story with great personal investment. "Why didn't anyone say that?" Byron asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Cord picked up a piece of cornbread from the table, examined it with no particular urgency. "She asked them not to." The guests began to leave as the afternoon thinned and the shadows stretched long across the grass. Wagons pulled away in ones and twos, yet the older women cleared the tables with an efficiency born of long practice. The canvas came down. The land returned slowly to its natural silence, the way it always did out here, not suddenly, but with a patience that felt almost intentional. Byron found himself alone with his wife for the first time. They stood perhaps 6 feet apart near the remnants of the gathering, the last of the daylight catching the edge of everything and making it look briefly, falsely golden. Iola had removed the veil hours ago. She wore it folded over one arm now, the ivory fabric trailing slightly, and she was looking out at the land with an expression that Byron could not fully interpret. He searched for something adequate to say and found the options wanting. "I didn't know about your father," he said finally, "or the property, for nobody told me." She turned to look at him. "I know," she said. "I asked them not to." "Why?" She considered that for a moment, not defensively, but genuinely, as though she was deciding how much of the true answer to offer. "Because I needed to know whether you would show up," she said. "Knowing nothing, having no reason beyond your father's word." Byron looked at her. "And if I hadn't?" Something moved across her expression. Not quite a smile, not quite relief. "Then I would have had my answer," she said simply, "and we both would have been spared considerably more complicated problems down the road." He didn't respond immediately. The wind moved through the high grass, and the last wagon disappeared around the tree line, and they were genuinely alone now in a way that felt different from any solitude Byron had experienced before. "Well, you were testing me," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a recognition. "I was being careful," she corrected, gently but without apology. They rode back to the Surrency ranch as the stars began to assert themselves in the darkening sky. Iola rode with a straightness in her back that spoke of long hours in the saddle from an early age. She knew the land under her horse's feet, the way Byron knew his own, instinctively, without needing to look down. The ranch house was larger than Byron had anticipated. 2 stories, stone foundation, wide porch wrapping around the front, and one side. It had the solidity of something built to last beyond a single generation, by someone who thought in those terms. Inside, lamps had been lit by someone who had anticipated their arrival. But the rooms were clean and spare, and carried the particular quality of spaces that have been lived in thoughtfully rather than carelessly. Iola showed him to a room on the upper floor without ceremony or awkwardness. She was matter-of-fact in the way that people are when they have made peace with a situation and simply intend to move through it honestly. "The house runs on a schedule," she said at the doorway. "I'll explain it tomorrow. There's a lot to learn, and no reason to rush all of it into one night." Byron nodded. Then, because something in him needed to ask, "Do you always make decisions this carefully?" She rested one hand on the doorframe and looked at him with those same direct eyes that had undone him in the church. "I used to make them quickly," she said. It didn't serve me well." She said goodnight and pulled the door gently closed behind her. Byron sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight and stared at nothing for a long time. The something from her past announced itself 3 days later. It came in the form of a rider, well-dressed for this country, which itself was a signal. His horse was too clean. His jacket fit too well. He arrived at the front gate on a Tuesday morning while Byron was helping one of the ranch hands repair a section of fence line, and he asked for Iola by her previous name, which Byron noted, and by a familiarity in his tone that Byron noted more. Iola came out onto the porch. She saw the rider, and for the first time since Byron had met her, the composure she carried like a second skin shifted, not dramatically, yet not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But Byron was watching closely. She went still in a way that was different from her natural stillness. The rider smiled up at her from his horse. "Iola," he said. "It's been a while." She did not return the smile. "Mr. Aldine," she said. Her voice was level, perfectly level, the kind of level that takes considerable effort to maintain. "I heard you got married," Aldine said, letting his eyes drift briefly to Byron, with an assessment that was neither friendly nor openly hostile, just measuring. "Congratulations. I thought perhaps we might still have some unfinished business to discuss." "We don't," Iola said. Aldine tilted his head slightly. "I think you know that's not entirely accurate." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Byron set down the fence tool in his hand slowly and turned to face the rider fully. And Iola, without looking at Byron, said quietly, "Go inside, please." It was the first time she had asked him for anything. He did not move. Byron did not go inside. He stood where he was, fence tool still loose in his hand, and looked at Aldine with the particular patience of a man who has decided that whatever is about to happen, he intends to be present for it. It was not aggression. It was not performance. It was simply the quiet, unmovable quality that certain men develop after years of working land that does not forgive carelessness. Iola felt it before she saw it. She turned to look at Byron, just briefly, and something in her expression shifted in a way she did not fully control. Aldine noticed too. His smile adjusted itself slightly, and becoming more careful. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Byron said. His voice was conversational. Easy. The kind of easy that costs something to maintain. "Reginald Aldine," the rider said. "I'm an old acquaintance of your wife's family. Business, mostly." He said the last word with a looseness that implied it covered a considerable range of things. "What business?" Byron asked. Aldine glanced at Iola. "Perhaps your wife can explain the details. She understands them better than most." "I'm asking you," Byron said. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Aldine was not accustomed to being held in place by a question. That much was readable in the slight tightening around his jaw, the way his horse shifted beneath him as though responding to a tension in the reins. Its rider wasn't aware he was applying, but he was a man who moved through rooms and conversations on his own terms, and Byron had simply declined to offer those terms. Iola stepped off the porch. "Reginald," she said quietly, coming to stand beside Byron in a positioning that was deliberate and unmistakable. "Whatever you came here to reopen, the answer is the same as when you asked it 14 months ago. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," Aldine said, his voice dropping its social pleasantness like a coat he no longer needed. "Your father is gone. You've been running that property alone, which means the original agreement he refused is still sitting on the table. I have patient investors, Iola. Patient men do not stay patient indefinitely." "What agreement?" Byron said. Iola looked at him, and this time she didn't look away. They sat on the porch together that evening after Aldine had gone, sent away without resolution, but also without the victory he had ridden in expecting. The sun was pulling itself below the tree line, and the ranch had settled into its dusk routine, cattle moving slowly toward water, the hands finishing their last tasks with the unhurried rhythm of people at the end of a long day. Iola held a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. "My father refused to sell the eastern portion of the land," she said. 3,000 acres along the creek bed. Aldine represented a group of men who wanted it for water rights. They made the offer 4 times. My father refused 4 times. She paused. "After he died, Aldine came back. He assumed I would be easier to move." "Was he right?" Byron asked. She looked at him steadily. "What do you think?" Byron almost smiled. "I think he rode away without what he came for. He'll come back," she said. "He always does. And now," she stopped, looked out at the land. "Now there are legal questions about the property that marriage complicates or simplifies, depending on how things are structured. My father's lawyer is working through it, but Aldine knows that too. He's not unintelligent." Byron was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you agreed to this?" he asked. "The marriage, protection for the land." It was the question that had been living underneath everything since the church. He had not asked it until now because he was not certain he wanted the answer. Iola turned her cup slowly in her hands. "It was part of the reason," she said. "What, in the beginning? And now?" She was quiet for long enough that the evening insects began their first tentative sounds in the grass below the porch. "Now I'm less certain about my original reasoning," she said quietly, "which is an uncomfortable position for someone who prefers to be certain." The weeks that followed moved with the rhythm of the land, which is to say, they moved according to what needed doing rather than what anyone felt like doing, and there was something clarifying about that. Byron learned the Surrency ranch the way he had learned everything difficult in his life, by showing up before he was ready and paying close attention. He learned that Iola rose before dawn without exception, that she kept the ranch accounts in a leather ledger with a precision that would have impressed men twice her age with twice her experience, that she was harder on herself than on anyone who worked for her, and that the hands respected her for it, in the way that people respect someone who demands most from themselves first. He learned that she read in the evenings by lamplight, history mostly, occasionally law, and that she had strong opinions about water management that she expressed with a directness that still occasionally caught him off guard. He learned that she laughed rarely, but when she did, it was without reservation, and that it changed her face entirely, and that he had begun, without fully acknowledging it, to listen for it across whatever distance separated them at any given moment in the day. She learned him, too, that he saw it happening, the gradual accumulation of small observations, the way she began to anticipate his patterns. She noticed that he checked the horses last thing every night without being asked, that he fixed things quietly, without reporting that he had fixed them, that he was uncomfortable with gratitude expressed too directly, and so she learned to offer it sideways, in practical acknowledgement rather than open statement. They were two careful people learning each other in careful increments. It was slow. It was honest. It was nothing like Byron had imagined his life looking, and he had almost entirely stopped mourning the version he had imagined before. Aldine returned on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the wedding. This time, he brought a lawyer. Byron met them at the gate. And he had known they were coming, not through any particular intelligence, but through the simple logic of knowing what kind of man Aldine was, and how that kind of man operated when patience wore through. He had spent the previous week sitting with Iola and her father's lawyer, going through every document, every deed, every recorded agreement in the Surrency ledgers. He understood the land now, at least on paper. More importantly, he understood what Aldine wanted and precisely why he could not have it. "Mr. Windermere," Aldine said from his horse, making the name sound like a question. "Mr. Aldine," Byron said. He did not step aside from the gate. The lawyer, young, uncomfortable in the saddle, clearly more accustomed to offices than open country, cleared his throat. "Well, we're here regarding the matter of the eastern acreage and the water rights therein. As Mrs. Windermere's husband, you now have joint—" "I'm familiar with what I have," Byron said. "I'm also familiar with what you have, which is a verbal agreement that was refused in writing 4 times by Edmund Surrency and has no standing." He looked at Aldine directly. "You're welcome to test that in a territorial court. I understand the judge in this district is a thorough man." Aldine studied him for a long moment. "Your wife has been educating you," he said. "My wife is considerably more patient than I am," Byron said. "I'd take the offer she's prepared to make you for the southwest parcel, which is fair and documented, and ride back to wherever you came from before I stop being polite about this." They took the offer. Not immediately. Men like Aldine never concede immediately. It is a point of personal philosophy. But by the end of the following week, through the lawyer, the agreement was signed. The eastern acreage and its water rights remained Windermere land. Would remain so now, for considerably longer than either Iola or Byron would be alive to see. Iola read the signed document at the kitchen table on a Friday evening. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked across the table at Byron, with an expression he had not seen on her before, open in a way she rarely allowed, like a window that had been painted shut for years and had finally been worked loose. "Thank you," she said. Byron looked at her. "You would have managed it without me." "Yes," she said, "but I didn't have to." It was such a small thing to say, such a quiet, uncomplicated acknowledgement of a fact. But Byron understood, because he had learned her language by now, that for Iola Windermere, admitting she had not faced something alone was not a small thing at all. It was perhaps the most significant thing she knew how to offer. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She looked down at his hand, then back up at him. She did not pull away. The following spring, the Windermere Ranch, for that was what people in the surrounding county had taken to calling the combined property, understanding instinctively that it now operated as a single thing, welcomed its first child into the world on a morning that arrived with that particular clarity that certain spring mornings carry, as though the air itself has been washed clean overnight. Byron sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours and stared at the floor and did not pretend to be calm. When Cord finally opened the door and looked at him with an expression that answered every question before Byron could ask it, Byron stood up slowly, pressed one hand briefly against the old foreman's shoulder, and walked inside. Iola was exhausted in the way that redefines the word. She lay against the pillows with her hair loose and her eyes heavy, and a look on her face that Byron had never seen before. Not the composure, not the directness, not the careful measuring that had defined her from the first moment he'd seen her in that church. Just something unguarded and complete. She was holding their daughter. Byron sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the small and astonishing fact of the child in her arms, and could not find a single word that was adequate. So he said nothing. He put his arm around Iola's shoulders, and she leaned into him, actually leaned, without calculation or careful positioning, just the simple human weight of someone allowing themselves to rest. And they stayed like that, while the morning light moved slowly across the floor of the room. Outside, the land stretched in every direction, every acre of it held, every fence line intact, every creek still running as it always had. The eastern pasture caught the early sun the way it always did this time of year, the grass carrying that brief, brilliant green that the summer would eventually burn back to gold. It was theirs, all of it, and more than the land, the life built on top of it, as slowly and honestly and without either of them fully anticipating where the other would fit until they already had. Byron looked at Iola. She was looking at their daughter with an expression that answered every question about who she was more completely than anything she had ever said or done in his presence. He thought about the man who had ridden west 3 seasons ago with low expectations and quiet resignation, building a picture of a stranger in his mind because the open space made him uneasy. He thought about how wrong that man had been, and he was grateful, in the particular, uncomplicated way that a man is grateful when life corrects him gently instead of harshly, that he had shown up anyway.